Anything worth doing is worth doing right. I couldn't agree more. Our country is at a pivotal moment in energy policy. It's important that we do it right. There have never been so many worthy energy options. They're worth doing, and they're worth doing right. Thankfully, we're already making progress diversifying our energy portfolio. We have an opportunity through tax reform to drive that progress further. When I first ran for Congress, America was reeling from an oil embargo. Gas prices had doubled. At one point in early 1974, 20% of American gas stations had no fuel at all. It's clear that we could never again allow America to be so dependent on a single source of energy. Since then, we have boosted a more diverse, efficient, and productive energy policy. Advances in technology mean more domestic oil and natural gas are available than ever before. We also have more renewable and clean energy sources, but we can do more. We are still, I think, too reliant on fossil-based energy sources. 94% of the energy used in the transportation sector comes from oil. Only 10% of our electricity consumption is generated from renewable or clean energy resources. Our country needs a diverse energy sector like we have in my home state of Montana. So I'll just brag a little bit. We are an energy state. We are one of a dozen states that produce more energy than we consume. In eastern Montana, at the edge of the Bakken Formation, next to North Dakota, my colleague to my right knows this all too well because Bakken is even greater formation in North Dakota than it is in Montana. Our oil and gas fields are going through a renaissance. Technology has unleashed the oil and gas potential and created thousands of jobs. In central Montana, wind turbine blades harness the power of the Chinook winds. Wind farms in Montana now power 100,000 homes. 3 new wind farms are being built. And in western Montana, biomass powers sawmills and adds electricity to the grid. Montana also produces 45 million tons of low-sulfur coal each year, and we're leading the way on carbon capture and sequestration. National energy policy, I think, should replicate a lot of this mix. If we don't develop U.S. energy policy, we will continue to be subject to the whims of foreign dictators and the sudden spikes in the price of oil. We will be one hurricane or one regime change away from $6 gasoline. That would be disastrous for our economy. A $1 increase in the price of gasoline costs Americans $110 billion a year. We're all too aware of that in our state. The tax code is an important driver of energy policy. Tax incentives, as I mentioned, provide 85% of the energy sector's federal support. These provisions cover almost every conceivable form of energy: nuclear, oil, gas, coal, wind, solar, and geothermal. Tax provisions also cover a wide variety of energy use, from powering common home appliances to running massive factories. But these incentives can be improved. Currently, the type and level of tax incentives varies for different technologies. Some incentives are temporary, others permanent. In some cases, there are multiple incentives for the same technology. The result is inefficiency. Provisions that don't create jobs or improve our energy policy should expire or be repealed. Right now, we're providing direct incentives to select technologies and industries. Perhaps we should adopt a more technology-neutral approach and stop playing favorites. That way, we could still help new energy technologies develop, but let the market decide which ones stick. Tax reform is an opportunity for the energy sector to make real progress. It can move us further from foreign oil. It can lead us down a road to a diverse, clean, and secure energy resource. So let us seize the opportunity as we develop domestic energy. Let's also focus on efficiency, try to make the code less complex. Let's use the tax reform to ensure our company has a more secure and diverse energy supply. And as Mr. Thompson wrote, let us find the things worth doing. Let us do them right. Senator Hatch.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Chairman for once again holding a critical hearing on tax reform. We've had a large number of these hearings, and they've been very helpful. especially as we go into this next year and the remaining part of this year. It is essential that we continue these discussions in pursuit of reforming a tax code which is complicated, unfair, and difficult to administer. We cannot afford as a nation a tax code that prevents our full potential for economic growth. Looking at the witnesses, it is clear that we have a good representation of different viewpoints about the various energy sources addressed throughout the tax code itself. My hope is that this hearing will contribute to our goal of comprehensive tax reform in the near future. It is important to conduct our examination today with President Reagan's 3 criteria for tax reform as our guideposts. We will be looking at the fairness of the system. We'll be looking at the efficiency of the system with a particular emphasis on its anti-growth features, and we will be looking at the complexity of the current tax code. If we keep these principles in mind, I am optimistic that this committee will be in a position to reform our tax code in a way that is better for families, businesses, and our economy. I know many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle hope to achieve a tax reform that lowers rates while broadening the tax base. However, from my perspective, there's another feature that will be essential for any successful tax reform. Tax reform should be about tax reform, not about deficit reduction. We should be simplifying our tax code and lowering rates to create a more fair system that generates the economic growth necessary to generate jobs and revenue itself. It would be a mistake to call tax increases tax reform and use that increased revenue to achieve deficit reduction rather than pro-growth rate reductions. Today, we are prospectively focusing on what role, if any, energy policy should play in the tax code. Energy policy has been creeping into the tax code at an exponential rate. Yesterday, I heard the chairman compare the tax code to the Hydra, the hundred-headed creature of Greek mythology. Each time you cut off one head, 2 more grow back. I believe this analogy is particularly apt with respect to energy tax provisions. I hope today that we can have an open debate about whether, going forward, there is a role for energy policy in the tax code, and if so, what that role should be. I could keep talking, but there's no tax incentive for producing a lot of hot air yet, so I'll just let the witnesses get to it. And I want to thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to hearing from our panel here today.
Thank you, Senator. It's now my honor to introduce our panel. Especially honored to introduce our first witness, Don Nickles, currently Chairman and CEO of the Nickles Group, but for 24 years represented the great state of Oklahoma, a valuable member of this committee. And I just welcome you back, Don. It's just great seeing you. I particularly remember your incisive and persistent and perceptive points of view. I deeply appreciate your return. Next is the Honorable Phil Sharp. Phil is currently the President of Resources for the Future, and for 20 years represented Indiana's 2nd District in the U.S. House of Representatives. Matter of fact, Phil and I were freshmen in the House, that Watergate class, 1974. Very fond memories of that, especially of you, Phil, when you're one of the sharpest, no pun intended, members of the group. Our third witness, Dale Jorgensen. Dr. Jorgensen is a Samuel W. Morris University professor of the Department of Economics at Harvard. As it turns out, Dr. Jorgensen and I are fellow alumni of the same high school in Helena, Montana. I might add, former chairman of this committee, Bill Roth, is an alumnus from that same high school. There are 3 of us. Helena High, it's a good school. 2 years in a row, we didn't make state championship football, but we were runners-up 2 years in a row. But
they had a great basketball team, though.
Had great basketball. Back in your era, they won. They won the championships. That's true. Thank you. Finally, we have Mr. Harold Hamm. Mr. Hamm is the Chairman and CEO of Continental Resources, a position he's served in since its inception in 1967. Thank you all for coming very much. You all know our practice. At least assume you do. Certainly you do, Don. So I speak for about 5-6 minutes. Everyone utilize, and all your statements will be inserted in the record. Go ahead, Don. We're glad to have you here. And let her rip. I tell all our witnesses, pull no punches, tell it like it is. Life's short. Can't take it with you. Go for it.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and it's a pleasure for me to be on the panel and join my colleagues on the panel, especially Harold Hamm, who's built just one heck of a company in Oklahoma, Continental Resources, and doing so much in North Dakota and Montana, but also in Oklahoma. And they've added hundreds and hundreds of jobs and a lot of valuable resources to this country, so it's a pleasure to join him as well. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned talking about tax reform and doing it right. I remember being in this body and particularly this committee. And in my 24 years in the Senate, I love this committee. This committee and those that got on it. And it takes a long time to get on the committee. But it's a great committee. And you're doing really great work, and especially if the Senate works. And so I'm a big advocate for regular order and marking up. And that's the tradition of this committee, is marking up bills and having lots of amendments and lots of debate. And we did that on countless bills. I remember in some of the best time in my service in the Senate was when we had tax bills and we considered hundreds and hundreds of amendments in the committee and or on the floor. And so I urge you in the process portion of this, whether you're talking about extenders, whether you're talking about trying to avoid the calamity of the end of this year, beginning of next year, or restructuring the tax code, regular order is the process. And that way the Senate works, and it makes the Senate such a special place to be. You also mentioned doing it right, and you're talking about energy taxation. I ran for Senate because of the windfall profits tax. Absolutely, if Congress hadn't passed that in '79, I wouldn't be here, or wouldn't have been here. But it motivated me. I was a state senator at the time, but I disagreed with that so strongly. So when I say do it right, I think we're talking about good tax policy. And good tax policy is good economics, makes sense. You don't have to pick winners and choosers. Windfall profits tax discouraged domestic production, encouraged imports. How absurd. We finally got rid of it. But it was a terrible idea. There's some other bad ideas that are out there. The administration talked about, well, let's do away with IDCs. They had a comment in their statement. They said that IDCs, expensing of IDCs like other oil and gas preferences, the administration proposed to repeal, distorts markets by encouraging more investment in the oil and gas industry than would occur under a neutral system. To the extent expensing encourages overproduction of oil and gas, it's detrimental to the long-term energy security and also inconsistent with the administration's policy of reducing carbon emissions. What a crazy statement. Crazy statement. Good tax policy allows expensing, certainly of wages. Mostly intangible drilling costs are wages. The tax code, you should allow any industry to expense the wages that are incurred in the year that they're made, not necessarily credit. This is not a credit. This is not a credit against taxes. It's expensing. So it's expensing non-recoverable business expense. You ought to be able to expense that. So I defend that. They also call 199 a subsidy to big oil. Hogwash. Now, I was on the committee when we created Section 199, a lower corporate rate for manufacturers. And some of you may remember I was a manufacturer before coming to the Senate. But I argued against it. And I still think it's bad policy. I think you ought to have a uniform, so when you're reforming the tax code, have a uniform corporate tax rate, not a lower rate for manufacturers versus service companies or other companies. It's very confusing, very difficult. And then in past law, we said, well, all manufacturers get it except for oil. Oh, we're not going to give them the full benefit of the Section 199, which is basically a 3-point reduction in corporate rate. Big oil only gets a couple of points of it. But it's bad policy. So I urge you to have a uniform corporate rate. And I might mention, too, there are some companies that have both. They are manufacturers, they're financial companies, they're one and the same. They have both. And so then they have all this accounting challenge trying to figure out what is what. So anyway, where you're trying to come up with a more uniform, lower, more competitive rate, and I think everybody, Democrats and Republicans, are talking about that. God bless you. Keep it up. A lower rate, a more competitive rate, a competitive international rate, which probably means going to a territorial system, makes good common sense. And to eliminate deductions, exemptions, and credits along the way, not deductions, but exemptions and credits, I think makes sense. Tax all income once. We have a lot of income that's not taxed. So you can help lower the rate by doing so. There's also a proposal eliminating dual capacity. And I'll just say, if you want to have U.S. headquartered oil companies, if you eliminate that, you're going to double tax their foreign earnings, and as a result of that, net result is Total, British Petroleum, other foreign countries are going to be winning all the international deals. And that would just really be a dumb thing for us to do, very short-sighted. And I could go on, Mr. Chairman, but I just think making good tax policy isn't good energy policy, it's good tax policy. Good tax policy would apply to all industries, and I would encourage the committee to advance its work. I compliment the committee to do it, and I encourage you for as much as can be done this year to avoid the end-year challenges and for totally reforming the system. I encourage you along that way. I think it's very exciting, and hopefully you will be successful. This committee, for it to be successful, this committee has to lead, and I hope and pray that you do.
Thank you,